All right, friends from around the country and world, welcome to another Global Immersion webinar. We're grateful to have you with us, and we're grateful for each of those on this call with us as panelists. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I think it's going to be really, really tangible and real for the world that we're in right now. My name is John Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion, and we are a peacemaking training organization who works with specifically with followers of Jesus to help activate us as instruments of peace in our world. And we offer these trainings in a lot of different contexts, whether in workshops with staff teams or with universities, or in immersion trips where we go into areas of global conflict to learn the work of peace from people that are practicing it. And we also have contexts like this, e-courses and webinars, where we talk about issues and conflicts that are real in our world and begin to ask questions like, what would it look like for us as followers of Jesus to live as everyday peacemakers in the midst of those? And so that's going to be our work today. And specifically, our book, Mending the Divides, Creative Love in a Conflicted World, that I wrote with Jer Swigert, the co-founder of Global Immersion, came out about 2 months ago. And our hope with this was really to capture the theology and practice for everyday peacemaking that we have been living out and now training for years, and to harvest a lot of stories of ways that people are living out this, what we would consider very costly and subversive way of life that is everyday peacemaking in our world today. And you hear stories from the Middle East, you hear stories from our US-Mexico border, you hear stories in homes and on streets of neighborhoods. And as we were thinking about this webinar specifically as a way to talk about how this isn't like a book isn't inspiring, but the message of this book is what we care about. And it feels, and we realize it's more timely now than it maybe has been at least in my generation, as we look at a world where we spend 5 minutes on our smartphones and we see the brokenness and divide every day. And what are the ways that we are not only going to hang on to the stories of hope and restoration, but what are ways that we're going to actually participate in the hope and restoration that we believe was made real in Jesus' death and resurrection? And so as we think about that, really tangibly, we're asking the question, well, where are the primary classrooms where this stuff gets played out, and ways that actually shape and inform the way that the Jesus community lives and moves in our world? And families and churches are two of those primary classrooms. So that's what we're going to lean into today. What does it look like for us to create a culture and a practice of everyday peacemaking in our homes and with our families, and also with our faith communities on the streets of our neighborhoods, with the hope that our churches are actually seen as an instrument of peace in our city and in our world? Because the perception of the church largely has been that it is more a conduit of violence, or at least perpetuating it in our world. And that's something we need to acknowledge and lament, and then take seriously. What does it look like for us to actually live as an instrument of peace? And so if you've read the book, you'll hear lots of stories that came out of Jer and my personal families and neighborhoods, stories of Jackie, Jer's wife, befriending and walking with a neighbor who had to sell drugs out of her house to sustain her family finances because her husband left. I shared a story about my little 4-year-old daughter who was in preschool, and I was asked to share what I do as a peacemaking trainer. And as I share that I'm a peacemaker, all the kids in unison yelled, "He's a pizza maker!" And like in their little minds, peacemaking was so foreign that the only category they had for it was to think of me as a pizza maker, which is actually kind of true to when you talk about peacemaking anywhere. It's just confusing. It often feels nebulous. It feels 30,000 feet. It feels idealistic. And what we're saying is, no, this is actually some of the most costly subversive work of discipleship. And so we talked about ways that our faith communities, Jer and my here in San Diego and his in the Bay Area and now up in Oregon, are trying to live this stuff out. And so today we have two practitioners, Lisa Scandrette and Jeremiah Kim, who represent both those that are working with their families to create a culture and DNA of everyday peacemaking, and working as local pastors in a church specifically to live this stuff out. So this webinar, a couple things we need to say housekeeping wise. We need your questions. We are hoping to have some time at the end of this to have an open Q&A with Lisa and Jeremiah specifically about how this plays out in families and in churches. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A function. Click on that, and as you're hearing us talk, or as questions come in, or even if you came in with questions already, begin to drop those in there. And over the course of the next half hour or so, we'll be scanning through those and then be able to conclude with some Q&A. In the chat function, which is right next to the Q&A, if you would jump in and say your name and where you're from, and if you want to be real ambitious, say why you're on this webinar or why you think this matters for you, that would be really helpful just for us to get an idea of where everyone's coming to the table here today. So let's open up with families. Why this webinar, and what is there to expect families specifically? You know, we're entering into a unique moment in our calendar where Thanksgiving and Christmas are right around the corner. And this is the moment where many families are already feeling the angst and anxiety of sharing tables together. Others are thrilled and feeling the joy, maybe a little bit of both. And, you know, to make, again, this very tangible, what are the tools that we go into this season with as families to navigate the difference around our table? Right now, there's probably theological difference. There's certainly political difference. There's all sorts of, there's maybe past hurt that hasn't been worked through. How are our families being formed to live into these moments of conflict? We would say conflict isn't a problem. It's actually an opportunity. We just need tools to engage conflict well. And that's what we outline in the book, and that's what we're going to talk about today. My family is young. We have 4 little kids, 7 and under. My wife, Jan, is in this we're in this together, trying to navigate it, and we're very much on the way. And so we actually have a guest star this morning. Jan, you want to come over here for a sec? Jan's going to introduce a little bit of why this topic of families matters for us specifically, and then I'll share a little bit about churches, and then we'll jump in with Lisa and Jeremiah. Dear.
Hello.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you. So I am wearing Ruby Woo lipstick this morning, and we are following the Ruby Woo pilgrimage happening right now. And my daughters are wearing this lipstick this week as well, and it's following Lisa Sharon Harper and a bunch of amazing women activists following the story of our 4 mothers happening right now. So if you get a chance, get some lipstick on and go follow them as well. And I say that because that's just a part of what I'm trying to engage with my kids, of what is happening and what are people already doing, and how can I bring my kids in that as well too. And if it involves lipstick, that's great as well. So yeah, I think this issue of peace and families, I am perplexed by it. And Johnny and I question our parenting and reproductive decisions every day. Because it would be amazing to have one, or just to be him and I traveling the world and having a great time. But that's not our life. We have 4 little ones, and they're amazing treasures, but we're definitely in a season of chaos right now. And I think our main issues that we talk about is we have homeless right outside our door. Even as we're looking out in our new house, we have an alleyway, and homeless walk back and forth our alleyway as we eat breakfast. And so it's we talk about it each day with the kids. How do we see the face of God in them? Who are they? What's their story? How can we engage in them? How can we make some food and maybe go out and bring it to them? And how can we see these issues as opportunities and not as threats too? But I feel like these activist conversations are happening each day, and how do we make it accessible to 7 and under as well? Another thing
in regards to the community that's homeless here, San Diego has become like the epicenter of homelessness, as you probably know, in our country, and Hep A is a major deal, and that's right outside our door. We're in that neighborhood.
We have the new camp too right by us as well.
Yeah, and so, you know, even with our kiddos, they culturally somehow have already acquired this like knee-jerk reaction to fear that community. And so like wrestling with those conversations, like why are you scared here? Yeah. What's the source of that? Yep. Why, like, what's the story we're believing about these people who happen to be our neighbors? And seeing that as a formational moment, as challenging as it is, has been something we've been wrestling with.
Yeah. So we don't know how to do it. We're figuring it out each day. And so we're excited for other people to help us who are further down the road too. But I think the main thing that we are trying to teach our kids are, and this is from our last trip we just took to Israel, Palestine, one of our peacemakers, Liel, said something really profound that helped me kind of like with the whole trip, but also how do I bring this back to the kids? He said, the powerful want peace and the powerless want justice. So I feel like through that lens, I can talk about race or how we treat animals or how what's happening to women in the world, or, who is in power and who is powerless, and how can we see that dynamic and what can we do to be a part of that and to bring change too. So I feel like that's a phrase that we're trying to figure out as well too.
And even to acknowledge with our kiddos that we've inherited a lot of the power.
We have.
We are white Christian middle class folks in America. And so how do we even begin to teach them about privilege and power and understand the perspective of the powerless, not necessarily as a threat, but as an opportunity for formation? How
do we know our white story? As I'm reading about Rosa Parks and they're seeing how the white people in that story treated Rosa Parks. And so that was interesting, trying to talk to them about that too. And because we need to know how our family treated and everything too. Anyway, it's mumbled, but we're trying to figure it out. So
good.
Yeah.
Any other tangible stuff that why this matters with family? Like even thinking about the music, the liturgies we put into their brains.
Dear. Yeah. Ruby has been really into the Brilliance, and we actually listen to it kind of in the mornings to get us going. And her sweet little voice has been singing, broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole again. So we've been singing that as we go to school. And just for her to be deciphering those words, put down our weapons and take on love, and kind of talking to her about that has been really sweet. Yeah.
Thanks, girl.
Okay, that's all I got.
It's fun to be in it with you.
Thank you.
And this work of everyday peacemaking isn't an idea. Like for us, it's become so tangible. Every day on the way to school, we're praying what it means to be a peacemaker today. And then after school, we talk about what did that look like? How did that go? What were the challenges? But I think the big piece is like, we're trying to take seriously the fact that these 4 little humans that we've been entrusted with is probably the biggest contribution we'll make to participating with God and restoring our world.
And the real parents aren't coming back. We're it. So
I guess we're the ones, aren't we?
Yeah. Right.
Thanks, girl. Okay, and then churches. Why does this matter for churches? And we're not going to spend as much time introducing this, and Jeremiah's going to deep dive us into it. But we actually believe that churches have one of the most significant opportunities to be a reflection of the one we follow in this moment. And what does it mean for these communities of Jesus who say that our friend Dayoud Nasser, I think this is in the book actually, says, he's a Christian Palestinian living in the West Bank. He says, if you American Christians would follow the Jesus you talk about, our world would be a completely different place. And it would be much better. And so what does the church, the followers of Jesus, these communities of Jesus have to do with informing our conflicted world? Not to stick our heads in the sand and act like it's not happening, but to be on the front lines, waging peace in the midst of our conflict. So that the family is the church of the future. The churches are the church of the now, and we're going to need to dive into that. So all that being said, let's move into our conversation with Lisa and Jeremiah. Lisa is a dear friend. Her and her husband, Mark, live in San Francisco. They've been guides and mentors really to us from afar for a lot of years. And their new book, Belonging and Becoming, Creating a Thriving Family Culture, is so good and so relevant to this conversation. I'd say one of the tangible takeaways from this webinar is to get that book and read it with, if you have a spouse, read it with them. If you have kids, all the better. It'll be very tangible. And they've been living this out for decades on the streets of their neighborhood and in their home. Jeremiah is the proud son of Korean immigrants. Maybe we'll get to hear some more about that, but the interesting intersection of ethnicity and American evangelicalism, and a pastor in a local church here in San Diego called The Flood is going to give us some 3D lenses for what this could look like on the ground in a local church context. And so thrilled to have Jeremiah with us. Let's crack this conversation open with Lisa. I'll open it up to you just to introduce yourself a little bit more and share a little bit about why this matters for you and your family.
Thanks, John, for having me here today. Let me tell you a little bit about my family's journey towards peacemaking, and then I'll go to the bigger question. Our family moved to the Mission District of San Francisco 20 years ago, and it's probably the biggest experiment in peacemaking we've ever done. We both moved from Minnesota, from fairly homogeneous communities, And suddenly we found ourselves surrounded by people, both in our community and in groups we joined and in places that we were traveling, that on the surface we had very little in common with. This is 20 years ago, so we didn't really know a gay person before we moved to San Francisco. And that might sound really antiquated now, but it was a stretch for us. Our neighborhood was full of gang violence and a lot of homeless people as well. And the circles we found ourselves in with our kids were Christians were the minority, and we often got a lot of pushback from people. So our communities were filled with artists and people of other faiths, and it was a brand new place for us to navigate and see other people as they are, made in the image of God, and learn how to listen and learn and become neighbors and friends in this context. So we've been learning how to do that for the last 20 years. And I still sometimes feel very much a beginner in the process. I think that family is so important to this peacemaking discussion, because family is the place where we first begin to learn what the world is like, how we're going to see the world, how it helps shape our first thoughts about God and who God is, what God is like, what it means to love. And family has the potential to be a real powerful incubator for peacemaking. For one thing, we can cultivate a very safe place there, where we can operate out of a context of belonging. So if we can learn to make peace in our families and in our homes and with our extended families, those are skills that we can bring to the world at large. So I see families' role in peacemaking as kind of a twofold thing. One, to learn the inner journey to make peace with one another. And second, to bring those skills to the streets, to the people around us, to our schools, our neighbors, and our communities. As I was thinking about this talk today, Mark and I have been traveling quite a bit, talking about our book and doing workshops. And when we talk about making peace within our family, that can be really difficult. We don't come by that naturally. In fact, I think a lot of us like to avoid conflict as much as possible rather than engage with it and find solutions and make peace with one another. But it's real good work. Mark and I, over the years, have kind of honed a process that we've taught to our kids for how we can make peace when we get into a conflict with one another. And if you don't have a process like that in your family, that's a great place to begin. So in our family, I think this overlaps real well with the steps in Mending the Divides as well. We use slightly different words. Maybe I can translate our process into the Mending the Divides thing. So internally, the first thing we do is see. We look at each other, whether this is like between Mark and I, or myself and one of our kids, or even helping the kids navigate conflict with each other. And remember that each person is a precious person created in the image of God, and that we can come together and see each other's needs and struggles and respond to them. The second part of that process is to really listen to each other, to hear each other's side of the story, to hear what's been frustrating or painful for us. And from that, we can come to a place where we can see our own part in creating the divide between us, and apologize, say, you know, it was wrong of me to use that tone of voice with you. I'm sorry I spoke that way to you. Will you forgive me? And once we reach that point of forgiveness, then we can affirm our love for each other and move on together towards solutions. Sometimes there's something we can fix, or a new way to do things together that helps us not to hurt each other in the future. Sometimes it's just a hug, or something like, you know, an affirmation that we love one another. But as we learn these skills within our family, both I'm thinking specifically immediate family, then we can take that to the Thanksgiving table, and we begin to become more skilled at this and can take it out to the world.
Awesome. Lisa, this is, I'm watching all the people jump in. By the way, everyone, thanks for posting your names and where you're from, and maybe some of the reasons you're on the webinar. I know many of you, and I know many of you have kids and are wrestling, like, are really leaning in with Lisa right now, like we are, of like, okay, what do you got for us? Because we are, this is a bigger challenge than anticipated. So as you're having those moments, drop them into the Q&A so we can begin to have those queue up, so we can get back to Lisa on some of those at the end of the call. And before we go back into your conversation, Lisa, I did forget to post this screenshot. Let me share this with you. If you're following along via social media, here is the info for our panelists, and feel free to tag them and get this word out beyond just those that are on the webinar, as we talk about and try to make normative this conversation of everyday peacemaking in family and in churches. Lisa, you talked a lot about the internal practice then of what it means to navigate conflict around our tables with our siblings and with our parents. What do you see as, even culturally, what are some of the obstacles that we have as families to taking this work seriously?
Oh, I can think of a few. First of all, it takes time. This is not a quick and easy fix. Sometimes within our family, it was some of the most exhausting work I've ever done, is trying to help, both for myself, but also between the kids, help them to hear each other and listen and remember they're on the same team and get to a place of peace. I think as we move out into the world, because like I said earlier, alluded to, I don't think that our family is just for itself. We do this work in our families so that we can extend ourselves to others. And as we try to do that, in addition to the obstacle of us being so busy as a culture, or encouraged to be so busy, there's also sometimes a lot of fear. Fear that we'll be hurt, fear that we might not do this right and we'll say the wrong thing. Fear that, just fear that there's going to be negative ramifications. And I've just found that it's really worth the time that it takes to create peace among us, and that fear is there's always some grain of truth in fear. We could be hurt, both physically or emotionally. We could say the wrong thing, but I think we also find on the other side of taking these risks to engage people around us or to do the hard work in our families, that there can be a lot of restoration. We can experience God's love and peace, and so much richness on the other side of taking those risks. So I would encourage us to just keep trying, even if we don't do it right, because we learn by doing it wrong, and then listening, and then trying again?
Um, I'm compelled. I think one of the big questions that many of us in families are asking, especially with kids, um, and I hear you talk about the kind of internal work, and then with the hope of this actually impacting and affecting our world in a positive way that moves us back towards shalom. There's this responsibility to create a safe space for our kids to grow and to be formed. But then we also don't want to isolate them or insulate them from the brokenness and injustice of our world. I would say that it's in exposing them to some of the areas of injustice that actually gives them the opportunity to see God's best work in the world, because we know that God is always at work in areas of injustice. So how do you as a family that's trying to cultivate this space of everyday peace around your table, how do you balance, okay, this needs to be a safe space internally, but I also need to expose my kids to the realities of my neighborhood? And so I'm one, curious how you and Mark have navigated that. And then two, is there a story that illustrates it, or is there a story in general that illustrates how this way of life is played out in your family life?
When we decided to move to San Francisco, one of our kids' Sunday school teachers said, "How could you bring your children there? How could you move them there?" And I had to think about that a while, but I realized, if this is where we feel that God has placed us, certainly our children weren't forgotten about, that this is their part of their path too. And I think that tension is good, to be thinking about those things. I think oftentimes, though, that the fear and the safety win out. So one of the things that we tried to do as part of our process along the way, when we knew that we were going to be going into a situation that felt risky, was we would sit down and talk together as a family. We'd talk about, where are we going and what are we doing? And what will we expect? So there was a time when our community, we wanted to get to know some of the people who lived outside in our neighborhood. And at the time, they congregated underneath the 101 freeway. And we wanted to begin to know them as human, not just as people populating our streets that we could easily walk past. And so our community decided that we wanted to do a joint barbecue with them on a regular basis. And so we began to do that and bring our kids along. So before we went, we would talk with them about what they might expect. We would talk about some safety and ground rules, like you can't go anywhere without anyone besides mom and dad. There's a particular place that will be the bathroom. You shouldn't play over there because it's dirty. That's where people use the bathroom. We would talk about what are some things that we could do together while we're there. Now, our neighbors who lived outside loved to see our kids. They were so excited to have contact with kids. They just didn't get that much. So the kids would brainstorm things they could ask, or they might bring a picture that they had colored, or, they would help out with the preparation of things. And then once we were away from the situation again, we would have a time where we would say, how was that for you? What did you experience? Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask me? So it was a balance for us about stepping into something risky, but also looking out for their safety at the same time.
Yeah, and I think too, like the intentionality of inviting them into the what and the why of that experience, like you're guiding them. And like, for example, this Saturday, a couple days from now, the U.S.-Mexico border wall is open for Children's Day. 12 families get to reunite for 2 minutes, Mexicans and Americans who otherwise can't see each other. We're going to take our kids there. We take them there regularly, but even hearing you talk about this, okay, what's the conversation we have in the car on the way there about why is there this wall that separates us? What are we going to see? What are the stories of these families that maybe we're not normally interacting with in our street and in our neighborhood? And then to have the kind of process afterwards about what emotions came up in them, what questions came up in that space. But as we're talking about shaping our families to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone, it seems like those kinds of experiences are the only ways to shape that, like that peacemaking muscle inside of our kiddos.
Yes. And I think it's good if they come back and they say that was really uncomfortable and it felt weird. I think we can affirm that and say, yeah, sometimes it's really awkward to learn to love somebody and care for them, but it's okay to feel awkward and uncomfortable. We can do that together. Instead of saying, it's okay to feel that way. And I think sometimes we feel funny that we feel out of sorts in a new environment, but that's a really normal feeling, and we can validate that, but still move on and support one another in those places.
So good. As you're all hearing, there's a fount of knowledge that we are grateful for with you, Lisa, and with Mark as you've lived this stuff out. And then we're going to come back. Some questions are coming in specific to family, so we'll get back to that here towards the end of the call. But as they come up, keep writing them in there for all of you that are listening. In regards to how to use Mending the Divides as a resource for families, I know a practice for us has been to really ask the question, how are we shaping our children to see this first practice of everyday peacemaking, to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone, whether that's political leaders that we begin to demonize with our language, or that's our neighbor that lives on the streets, or it's the migrant at the border. And what are ways that we're beginning to immerse our kids and our families into those spaces, seeking to understand what's going on in those spaces, and what might contending look like, our third practice, what might it mean for our family to contribute to the restoration of this broken individual or this broken system. Mm-hmm. So use some of those practices as a guide to lean into a lot of what we're hearing from Lisa, and as we share stories along the way. Let's transition here to Jeremiah, who again is a local pastor here in San Diego with Flood Church, and someone who is seeking to live this out in a congregational context and setting. And the big question we want to ask you, Jeremiah, in this space, you can open it up with some more introductions of who you are and what you do and why you do it. But how do churches, and most people on this call are probably part of a church, many might be pastors or leaders within them, how do churches embrace a common call to everyday peacemaking with the hopes of actually being an instrument of peace in our neighborhood, in our city, ultimately in our world? So Jeremiah, take us away.
Yeah, thanks, John. First of all, I really appreciate being part of this space and this conversation, because I feel like it's not only central to the calling of the church, but it's also timely, as you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation. And so I think one thing for me, as I just start to share about my own personal experience, that's important for me to say is that I feel personally, as Lisa was mentioning as well, really unqualified to represent kind of the church at large. I'm not an expert on peacemaking or ecclesiology, and so I'll leave that to the experts like John. But I think what I can share from is my own limited but focused experience here in San Diego as a part of a faith community, as John mentioned, Flood Church, for the past 12 years. And I think I even loved the brilliance of some of the questions that Lisa was unpacking for her families and processing some kind of new peacemaking practices, because I think those are the same, in just the same ways that we don't or aren't attentive to that kind of debriefing or unpacking and processing in our families. Those are the same ways that we need to grow in as churches and as communities, to ask, where are we and what is the Lord wanting us to see? And so I think as I've been in this context in San Diego, I've been a part of a congregation that's largely young, college-age, post-college young families. And we've been trying to ask the question of, if we've been placed here by the Lord for this season. San Diego is a really transient place, both in terms of vocational transiency for students, for military, for young families, but also obviously at the kind of crossroads of a lot of different communities in San Diego, from Mexico and different parts of the United States. What might the Lord have for us? What might the Lord be cultivating in and through us in this unique season? And so two kind of core convictions that I have in this conversation is that I believe that the church as a global community stewards the most robust, creative, and sustainable vision for an eternal way of living. As we talk about eternal life, what does that even mean? The church globally has stewards that vision. And the second conviction I have is that the local church grounds us in that vision. Throughout kind of the history of the church, that's been expressed through a variety of containers, whether that's kind of been called the kingdom of God, evangelism, and or the social gospel. And I think that peacemaking as a vehicle, as a container, is probably the most robust, sustainable, and resonant container that we have in this current context, socially and politically. And so I'm really excited about the possibilities of what peacemaking can cultivate in us, as not only as individuals and as families, but as communities of faith. So yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation, and yeah, excited to share.
Awesome. Sorry, I had to find my unmute there. So with all that in mind, like the opportunity seems clear. What would you say for a church day in and day out, week in and week out? You know, our focus often is we get to the weekend service and we do that really well. And we have a metric for success that usually revolves around things like attendance and tithing and our programs, and many of them great. What are some of the obstacles for a church to take seriously our call to be an instrument of peace in a place for the long haul?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the central tension of a lot of our faith practice, which is the gap between our belief in our kind of like intellectual theology and our functional theology, right? I think we would all look at I think the imperatives of our Christian faith to be bridge builders, peacemakers. But even as Lisa was sharing, in our families, we don't have the architecture to do that in our everyday lives. I think of one of the privileges that I have on the Flood team staff is that I get to support and walk with our midweek groups. And so throughout the community in San Diego, we have about 50 groups that meet regularly throughout as a part of our community. And when I talk with and sit with our group leaders, one of the biggest things that I see is just the lack of ability or imagination to work through conflict and to work through areas in which we kind of live in the tensions of everyday life. And so again, I love the questions that Lisa was asking, because oftentimes in our communities, when we hit up against a conflict, whether that's because of theological difference or social difference, or just a difference in perspective, our immediate reaction is to disengage. And so peacemaking, I think, gives us the framework to really enter into those spaces courageously, to get outside of our limited perspectives and to learn something not only from the Lord, but from each other. And it's only when we're able to kind of practice those in our families and in our church settings do we even have the chance to step outside of our faith communities to say, how can we be a part of the peacemaking that the world desperately needs?
That's good. What are some ways that you've seen your community lean into this? And doesn't necessarily, I know there's systemic change that has to often happen in a church where we often talk about this. There might be a smaller community within a larger church that's beginning to live and practice this stuff every single day, and that begins to infect the larger community as a whole. So they actually begin to see their formational, their discipleship journey is the call to be peacemakers, to join God in restoring what is broken. Have you seen some artifacts or any anecdotes of how you in your smaller community or larger Flood church, ways that your practice has intersected with the brokenness or conflict here in San Diego?
Yeah, and so for just a little bit more context, our community, as I said, we're younger, college age, young families, which means that we're really a unique subset of San Diego, where we're college educated, pretty monolithic in culture and ethnic background. And so one of the biggest practices for us is just to get outside, to see and to be immersed in the world, really outside of our limited perspectives. And I appreciated how you entered or or set up our conversation in the way that our families and our churches really are the laboratories to practice peace. Because I think for whatever reason, we might intuitively know that whenever you bring imperfect people together, there's going to be conflict. But somehow in kind of the evangelical imagination, we've assumed that the church is a place that's absent of conflict, or that somehow the church is kind of the bringer or the exporter of peace, when we haven't had the ability or developed the ability to develop peace within our own communities and within our own families. And so for us, it really is, how do we begin a practice of seeing and of immersing ourselves? And one of kind of the things, reflections that I've had is the story of Peter in Acts 10, where that's a story of the Lord giving him a vision of of a sheet coming down from heaven, unclean animals, and the Lord telling him to eat. And so in that moment, I think for Peter, there's a transformation of spiritual imagination, where he is having to unpack some of the kind of preconceptions or notions of what's in or what's out. But I think in our community, we've been really challenged to take that story to completion, where it's not just a spiritual imagination that needs to be transformed, but it's not until he gets a knock on the door and servants of Cornelius actually enter into his space, and that he's willing to enter into their space and follow him into the house of Cornelius. And so, as you mentioned, San Diego is just a rich community of opportunities to see and to be immersed in kind of the needs of peacemaking. There's one of the largest refugee populations that we have of displaced peoples in the state of California and in the United States. And so when we have our groups and when we have our people enter into those spaces, oftentimes it's motivated out of how can we materially help these individuals. But it's not full immersion until we put ourselves into places and spaces like a living room, where you don't speak the language of anyone else and you're just receiving hospitality through a cup of tea or through presence, that we are able to be vulnerable ourselves, to put ourselves in a position to say, we need to not only be agents of peacemaking, but we need to be transformed ourselves through the practice of peacemaking. And so that's something that we've tried to push our people, try to push ourselves and myself into really how integrally related seeing and immersion is in kind of our baby steps towards peacemaking.
Oh, it's so good. And I just totally resonate with what you just said. And that's one of our major themes in the book is, churches are really good at getting behind one-off projects, and we can be so project oriented that we put our primary, we can write the check to that issue on the other side of the world, or we can get enough jackets to this homeless shelter here, and then we can kind of pat ourselves on the back and be done with it and think like we actually participated in relationally engaging those on the margins, and we didn't, and sometimes it can do damage. If we don't properly, our friend, this is mentioned in the book, Luis, south of the border, who's a Mexican pastor, said nothing has more demobilized the Church of Tijuana than the U.S. American missions movement, short-term missions movement. And that's because we often, churches, skip the see and immerse that you're talking about. We don't actually do the work of building relationships and being present and identifying the assets that already exist. We just go to contend. We think we have the answers to the problems. We can fund it. We can mobilize the answer to the problem. And then we find out we actually don't even know if those answers are right. In fact, they could do more damage than they do good. When Helping Hurts is another great resource for that. And he's saying, your short-term missions movements, you don't know us. You don't know what we need. You think you do. And you come home and you give great reports of all the work you did. But it's actually demobilizing the Church of Tijuana to be the Church of Tijuana here in this space. And so I think that's a really good word. And I think a tangible practice, we would say, in regards to immersion is for local churches to identify the resources and assets of your city or neighborhood that already exist and be the best volunteer or partner imaginable. Don't think your church has to have your brand on everything and go start your own program. Do a little bit of work and see what already exists there. And when you walk in and say you're ready to volunteer, wait to see the response of these worn out nonprofits who are just slugging it out every day, doing amazing things, but under-resourced, and just be present. And yeah, and go have a cup of tea with a family who just came from Syria in the midst of their trauma. That's such a fertile soil for us to actually embody this message we talk about. Did you have anything else you want to add to that, Jeremiah, before I go into Q&A?
No, yeah, I think that's really the irony of this all, right? Is because we have a faith that the central tenet of the Christian practice is the incarnation of God Himself becoming to leaving His space to be vulnerable and to learn and to walk with us, and in that He gives of Himself fully. And I think as you were mentioning about your interactions with Christians from Israel Palestine is if we were to really take that seriously of what it means to be incarnational followers of Jesus, we might find that that we have a lot more to learn. We have a lot more to be transformed ourselves through the practice of faith than we might currently be finding ourselves. And so, yeah, I love that idea.
Awesome. All right, let's jump into some Q&A. There's some great questions in there. Lisa, you've probably been observing as they come in. Jeremiah, take a look. We will, if you have more, throw them in there. But let me go to you first on this one, Lisa. I think this is a great one from Kyle, who's a dear friend, by the way, Walling. He asked, what are some practical ways you remember to practice peace with your kids? I find it easier sometimes to go out as a peacemaker. Oop, did I break up there? I think we're okay. Out as a peacemaker, but get caught up in the frustrations of living with small people. Do you have a tangible reminder? How do you practice?
All right. So a couple questions there. I think to Kyle's question about busyness and the temptation to be busy, I think what's really been helpful for us is to have a conversation about what we really want to be about as a family. And then we can filter our activities through that lens. So when we do that, we can begin to say, you know, this is a good thing, but it doesn't really fit with where we want to go as a family and the direction we want to take. And it becomes easier to say no to some things so that we have time for the things that are really important to us. As far as peacemaking with little ones at home, boy, isn't that a challenge. I had 3 kids in 3 years, and I can definitely relate to that. I think one thing that really helped me in the middle of the chaos was to find a space during the day when I could grab a few minutes of quiet. Sometimes that looked like doing dishes, or sometimes it looked like getting up before the kids and just center myself and remember what I want to be about for the day. It was also helpful for me to have a couple of friends that were in the same life space that we could remind each other, hey, this is really important stuff we're doing. We're raising little humans, little people who are made in the image of God, and this is really important stuff to be able to form their early years. So I see another question there that I had wanted to address earlier about, you know, I live in a very urban neighborhood, but many people live in lots of different places. And so, but I believe that no matter where we live, even in rural areas, there are people who are in struggle. There are people who are alone and on the outside. And we can step into the lives of others no matter where we live, whether that's through our kids' schools. Maybe you find people there. Maybe we need to take some different routes. And just look around on our block, on the other side of town, and in those kinds of places. There's people who are in need of our coming alongside no matter where we live.
Awesome. Let's jump to a question with Jeremiah here. I think this is a big theological one, and I think it has to come down largely to our interpretation of the gospel, the good news. So I'd love to hear you interact with that. I have some thoughts on this one as well. But David asked the question, how do you deal with the pushback that a focus on peacemaking distracts from an often accepted definition of quote unquote sharing the gospel that the church is supposed to be involved with? In other words, that peacemaking is somehow maybe watering down or abdicating our responsibility to share the gospel.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and one that we wrestle with a lot. And I think from my personal reflection, it really comes down to just like we've decided that those are mutually exclusive, right? And so going back to the story in Acts of Peter, I think we need to be attentive to how or what has shaped our spiritual imagination through our practice of gathering, through our preaching, through our singing. Like, what is it that has shaped our understanding of what the gospel is and how people experience the gospel? And I think, again, this is why the seeing and contending is so important. When we think about missions, and just personally reflecting on my experience, both in the ethnic church and also at Flood, evangelism, gospel is such a huge idea in the same way that oftentimes peacemaking can seem. But when we're really attentive to seeing and immersing, we can't help but see the gospel implications and what good news might mean for our neighbors. And I think this is one subtle thing that I would just personally love to see in the church as evidence of our ability to see and to be immersed in, our willingness to immerse in the lives and stories of others, is can we move away from just having a blanket statement of saying the Lord is for the marginalized and oppressed, but can we be specific about who those individuals, who those families, who those communities are? And if as communities or as individuals we can't, or we find ourselves unable to be specific, perhaps that's an invitation for us to take a step back and to practice a little bit of that seeing and immersing. And I would believe, or I might suspect, that if we are attentive to that, we might see gospel implications all over the place.
So good. And I'll just add to, the first 3 chapters of the book really walk through a robust theological expose of how we understand that restoration ultimately is the mission of God. If all things were whole at the beginning of the story, there's a break as we grab the fruit of power. God makes it God's mission to restore what was broken. Like, that is the mission that God has done and is doing. And our vocation is to join in that work, is to be peacemakers. Like that is the good news, is that God is restoring all things. And so as we participate with God and through the Spirit in seeing restoration come about in our world, we actually get to participate in the good news being manifest. And it's going to look like a lot of different things. And I love even the life and teachings of Jesus, like the conversion moments that Jesus embodied in the Gospel's interpretation of his life and teachings didn't look like a salvation prayer really ever. There were some people that had more of that kind of transaction. Others, it was giving away their wealth and then they inherited the kingdom of God. And others meant it was walking away from different elements and walking towards life with Jesus. And so I think there's a way for us to understand it. Peacemaking, again, this isn't like a program we add to our services. This is a way of life we're invited into that informs the way we engage in all of these different realities and conflicts and brokenness in our world. And so if peacemaking is at the center, it gives us the tools to engage the reality of the broken world and participate in the restoration. Awesome. Boy, we have 6 minutes. Are either of you compelled by another question you want to jump in on before we close this thing down? I know for Lisa, this is one, if you could give us a brief interaction with how do we connect our local formation of families with global issues, that we're not just kind of insulated from the larger world as we move and practice locally.
So for our family, let me just speak from that perspective. I think what you said about this is a way that we think, this is a way that we learn how to move. That's been true for us as we've learned more and grown more. We try to take this approach when we're reading the news, when we're when we're deciding what to do, when things come up in culture and in life, to talk about things in terms of seeing God's image in people, listening and hearing what the problem is, and then seeing what we can do. So I think when we talk in terms of global issues, it gets a lot more complicated, and it's sometimes hard to know what a good response is. So there have been times that our family has taken trips. Mark was asked to speak at a YWAM base in south of the border, and we joined in some of the things that they were doing down there as a family, with a local orphanage that they had a long-term connection with. Mark is a Compassion International speaker, and he had the opportunity to take Haley with him to see the work that they do, particularly in El Salvador. And we followed the lead with our kids as well. A number of years ago, when there was the tsunami in Japan, our daughter was really concerned that people were left with nothing. She was in high school at the time, and they were planning their prom, and it was really uncomfortable for her that all these kids were going to spend all this money on one night when there were people who had little. And so she got her theater friends together and organized a benefit concert to raise money for tsunami relief for an organization that was doing work there. And our family had the privilege of kind of coming alongside her and helping facilitate that. And it was just amazing to see her step up. And I think it's really powerful to feel like there's something we can do to help. We don't have to just sit back. And keeping that tension between what's the best thing to do and let's just do something. Let's not let the trying to figure out the perfect thing keep us from engaging, so that we can learn how to do it better next time.
Totally. I think too, in a globalized world, almost every one of our cities and even small towns the world has come to us largely, whether it's in the form of migration or economics or whatever it might be, politics, like finding those areas where that intersects with our city. Like Jeremiah mentioned the refugee reality here in San Diego. Like if we bring our kids to go share a meal with a refugee family from Syria, we then can draw the connection to the global reality of war and refugees and movement, and like tying them really closely to an experience locally. I think you can then move to the global in a more constructive, experiential way that's a big deal.
Another really practical way for a family to start exploring these things is like, where do we source the things that our family uses? Where does our chocolate come from? Where does where do the things that we eat come from? And how does the way that we purchase those things affect the people who are harvesting them for us?
Good. Hey, I'm going to throw one more question back to both of you. If you could each give your best, most tangible practice in 30 seconds or so, the $1 million question. With Thanksgiving coming, how do we interact with aunts, cousins, uncles, adult siblings, and have a peaceful table? What's one practice we could think about as we jump on planes or get in cars or set our tables next week?
I'm going to borrow this one from something that Mark's inspired me to do. And that is, when faced with someone who feels really different than us, whether it's a family member or someone you see walking down the street, is to look at that person and say in your head, beloved child of God, may you be well. If you can remember that the person sitting across the table from us is a beloved child of God, I think that helps. The other thing I'm trying to do is listen and learn the art of asking good questions.
Beautiful. Jeremiah.
Yeah, I love that, because I think the idea of peacemaking is the reclamation of who we are made to be, right? Which is the full thriving of all of creation. And so that begins with reclaiming not just my own, but our collective, the ways in which we're made in the image of God. One thing that I would add to what Lisa said is that oftentimes to be restored into the image of God requires a little bit of challenge. And so I think depending on what your context is I would, to be a peacemaker requires courage. And so to be courageous in taking steps towards people, even as we listen to understand that there are voices that also need to be understood in the realities of our current social and global context. So, so may we be courageous this holiday season.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa and Jeremiah. This has been really helpful. Thank you to all of you for interacting so actively, both in the chat thread and in the Q&A. There are, specifically in the See and Immerse chapters of Mending the Divides, there's a lot of very tangible tools for what it looks like to share tables with people who might be different than us or have different perspectives in this tension we're feeling around family holidays. So take a look at that, and like we just heard, what does it mean for us to sit around those tables seeking to understand rather than just to be understood? Or we're coming into an agenda to make this person think this way or understand politics this way. Let's just get curious. Like Lisa said, ask good questions, and to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone, even our crazy uncles and aunts and grandmas and grandpas and siblings and across the board. So thank you both for your interaction with that. I'll close by saying a couple of ways to resource your formation as a family and as a church. Chapter 9 of Mending the Divides, we spend some time helping identify what is that conflict interpersonally, on a local level, or internationally that you're being called to engage. We're not trying to prescribe that, but giving some framework for how you can discern what it is you're going to roll up your sleeves and get after in your family, on your streets, in your neighborhood, or on a global level. Appendix A in the back of the book actually builds out a plan for how to engage that conflict over the next 10 days, the next 10 weeks, and the next 10 months. So highly recommend jumping into those. As a family, in regards to our work organizationally, you're welcome to join us on an immersion trip. Lisa talked about the power of global experience. If you ever wanted to bring your family to the border with us to experience the human reality of immigration and have a theology and practice for peacemaking guide that, jump in on one of our Immigrants Journey immersion trips. We have an open one coming up in May. We'll send in a follow-up email. And then churches that want to move into this, to actually see the journey go from where you are now to an instrument of peace in your city. We work specifically with churches and what we call a peacemaking pathway, where we work with your team to build out cohorts internally that then integrate this peacemaking framework into the life and ministry of your community. That's a bigger conversation, but feel free to reach out to us on how we can support and resource you towards those ends. We also do consulting and workshop with churches and executive teams on a regular basis. So all that being said, may we be a community of Jesus followers who don't see conflict as a problem, but as an opportunity. And may we be families who take seriously our call to shape and form the next generation of everyday peacemakers, and be churches who take seriously our call to join in God's restoring and restorative work in our world, and that it might be seen and felt and experienced in the most tangible ways around our tables and on our streets, and in a way that a watching world can't help but deny that God is actually at work and restoring all things, and may we be part of that. So towards those ends, may we go. Thanks for joining in on this webinar. We'll be following up with an email in the next day or two with resources from this call and a recording of it if you want to host a viewing party with your family or friends or your church in the days and weeks to come. Thanks.